So it's a great pleasure to introduce Heinz Kurz. He's professor of economics and director of the Graz Schumpeter Center at the University of Graz. He's a specialist in the history of economic thought. It's a subject that I always found interesting, even though I haven't worked on it. I've kept up a little bit. He has a very, very long and distinguished list of publications. I tried to count the number of books, but I gave up. There are at least 12, but at one point I thought there might be 60, including edited publications. The most recent is called Competition, Value, and Distribution in Classical Economics, Studies and Long Period Analysis. It's with jointly written with Balducci Salvatore. To get some idea of the difficulty of counting the books, here's the page from Google where you can see, or Amazon, where you can see a number of his books. And there's a 6 or 7 there, or maybe, and then it says view plus 5 more. And then here it says under edited books, view 25 plus more. So maybe Heinz can tell us just how many books he has done. Today he's going to talk about a piece which is coming out in the handbook. The paper is titled On Machine Ages, Causes, Forms, and Effects of Technological Change. The paper is about the first machine age, that is the Industrial Revolution, and the second machine age. In the first machine age, machine power replaced labor, but machines didn't learn themselves. In the second one, machines learned human skills like perception and cognition and communication, and superstar firms appear. One question the paper asks, and I have a feeling that this question is central to a lot of Professor Kurz's work, is what are the sources of capitalism's dynamism from within? Its restlessness, and its apparently insatiable thirst for novelty and change. You remember Marx, who's mentioned in this paper, talked about accumulate, that is Moses and the prophets for capitalists. And everyone's noticed this. And that's certainly a question worth asking today. So, Professor Hertz, I give it over to you.
Thanks very much, Professor Winthrop. Thanks very much for your kind introduction. I must confess that I cannot tell you how many books I've published. I don't know really. I would have to go back and start counting. But I hope that it is not just a question of quantity, that some of them might be even of interest to some of you, and perhaps even the one we have just been editing and which is in the process of being published. That is one on smart technologies. Now, thanks very much for having me here again in this Adam Smith seminar. So I just noticed that I've given a talk on essentially the same theme a while ago in the Adam Smith seminar, and ever since I hope some additional insights have been collected, and those I'm going to present today. It is indeed a paper that is very much dealing with the history of the subject in the sense of economists and philosophers of science and other people reflecting upon what is going on, this insatiable thirst for novelty and processes of creative destruction. And of course, what is in our view right now is the new machine age, called the second machine age by Brynjolfsson and others. And of course, that can be compared to the former, to the first machine age, which is essentially an age that is dominating the Industrial Revolution. Now, why does this not work? Oh. Yeah. Sorry. This is no, this is the contents. It's a lot, I'm afraid to say, but I will somehow hope to get through it. I shall start with a little history towards and beyond the first machine age. Then I will talk briefly about the antechamber of the Industrial Revolution. Then the first machine age, and that is essentially being dealt with by Adam Smith on the social division of labor, David Ricardo on improved machinery, Charles Babbage, who is occasionally called the father of the computer, Karl Marx, technical progress, which is both destructive and creative as regards society. I mean, bringing down to the knees capitalism as he thought, and providing the rise of socialism. Then there is a short interim period in which technical progress was largely no longer a major concern of economists. The focus of attention turned to allocation problems. And then the second machine age with learning machines and all that. And then a concluding remark. Now, the whole thing, what I am going to give today is taken from a chapter which I've written for a book edited by those four people on the left-hand side. Now, the SMART is the acronym for what we were doing. It does not imply that the people you can see below are smart in any sense. They are just those who have done the work. And the work culminated in the Routledge Handbook of Smart Technologies, which is with the publisher and ought to come out soon, I think February. That's what they have told us. Now, a little history towards and beyond the first machine age. Now, clearly, technological change was high on the agenda ever since the inception of systematic economic analysis at the time of the classical economists. Now, when I talk about classical economists today, I mean basically the British classical economists. Of course, one could also talk about the French, the Italians, and so on and so forth. They all contributed important pieces to an understanding of what was going on. But here, the focus of attention is on the British. The reason is mainly, I think, that technological progress and organizational change that took place prior to and around the Industrial Revolution was essentially very much dominated by British, but also by Dutch people. It was a period of transition, especially in Europe, from a time in which there were only sporadic and rare technological breakthroughs, and the growth of labor productivity was fairly low. It was not nil, of course not. I mean, there was progress, but it was not sustained. It was only around the turn of the 18th century that economists in Western Europe embarked on a path of sustained socio-economic development and growth, and productivity increases. Now, the Industrial Revolution heralded the first machine age. I think that is for sure, with machine power progressively replacing the labor power of humans and animals. And you can see in the literature how economists responded to what happened. I mean, that increase of labor productivity on a sustained basis. Marx spoke about labor productivity beginning to increase as in a greenhouse and growing geometrically. That was, so to speak, the new normal. It was different from the past. Benjamin Franklin spoke about man as a tool-making animal. And what Schumpeter then wrote, I think, is very apt, aptly describing the situation. Innovations became the overwhelming fact in the economic history of the capitalist society. They involved a process of creative destruction. So in order to understand the system, you ought to understand this engine that drives it continuously from within, the endogenous process that is at stake. And of course, what happened was that social economic development was subject to a movement of the frontier of economically useful knowledge outwards. It increased income per capita, not necessarily the income of all people, because distribution was very uneven and remained so for a long time and still is. And of course, if you want to try to understand the law of motion, as it was called by Marx, but also Schumpeter, of modern society, you ought to understand the causes, the forms, and effects of technological and organizational change. Now, what economists then understood quickly, at least some of them, such as Smith, was that increasing returns internal to the economy as a whole played an important role. The process of the division of labor is one in which increasing returns of that type internal to the economy as a whole, not just to single firms which would lead to monopoly, but to the system as a whole. And this implied, as Smith also pointed out, the process of circular and cumulative causation that feeds upon itself. Now, earlier authors also gradually began to understand that there are different forms or types of technological progress, and these have different effects. And these effects may be detrimental to some people, but very, very nice to others. Technological progress, it was understood, was a boon on the one hand that typically came with side effects, some of which were harmful to groups or classes of society. Think of the degradation of skills, child labor, unemployment, falling real wages in certain periods of time, pollution and fouling rivers because of dispensing with waste products into nature, a heating up of the economy, and eventually the planet, as we are very well aware of. It came with a process of rationalization, as Max Weber put it, with humans gradually taking control of the planet and bringing in a new age, now called the Anthropocene. Now, some of the effects triggered by certain waves of technological progress requested, and typically do request, further technological progress to clean up the mess created as an aside of technical progress and all the goodies it brings. Now, if you look at the history of mankind at a glance, in terms of I think a very, very nice picture by Vogel, the American historian, then you can see that the history of mankind was rather dull, so to speak, for centuries, if not millennia, and only started really to enter a new era at around the Industrial Revolution or the beginning of the Second Agricultural Revolution, when all of a sudden technical progress, medical innovations, and so on and so forth, generated a situation which allowed for a tremendous increase in world population. I mean, here you have an axis, the abscissa, which gives you time, and the other one population, and you can see that there is indeed a sharp break at around the, well, say 1800, 1820. And this also brought about what is known as the Great Divergence, the rise of Europe, and a dramatic change in the distribution of the generation of the social product across the world. Europe now caught up, I mean, actually went ahead, whereas other countries lost compared to Europe. If you look at 1820 and see Europe, I mean, really going into a boom for several decades, whereas other countries that led for long periods of time, such as India, China, went down. It was also the time of the birth of political economy. And political economy, of course, was keen to deal with the sea of facts in front of the eyes of observers. But the sea of facts are typically silent, and you needed tools to make them speak, and political economy was an attempt to make them speak. William Petty is occasionally called the founder of political economy, And he was indeed someone who, with particularly his book Political Arithmetic, published after he had died in 1690, he brought in a theoretical and at the same time empirical statistical approach to economic problems. Then there was François Quesnay with the Tableau économique, an attempt to understand the economic system as subdivided into subsystems that interact. There was Adam Smith, The Wealth of Nations, which is essentially a book about economic growth and development. And then, of course, David Ricardo. Now, let me come briefly to the antechamber of the Industrial Revolution. It is a time which I think was very well described by Marx in terms of what he called the production of absolute surplus value. That is a time in which innovations did not play such a dramatic role. They were sporadic, and the corresponding gains in productivity were swiftly annihilated by a growth of population vis-à-vis diminishing returns in agriculture, what was also called the Malthusian era. Growth was speeding up a little bit, but essentially because of high frugality, lower wages, longer working times, the elimination of holidays and so on and so forth. And Max Weber's Protestantic ethic and the spirit of capitalism is essentially dealing with that case, in which there is accelerated growth to a greater work ethic and all that. And that was very much shaped by Puritan ideas and Protestant ethic. But it was also a period, and this was not seen easily, which, so to speak, prepared the situation for the Industrial Revolution in terms of a culture of innovation, development, and growth that gradually sprang up in Europe as the unintended result of long series of disjoint institutional and social reforms that facilitated the communication between people who know things and people who produce things, and learned societies and academies that reduced the access cost to information and knowledge. There's a very nice book by Joel Mock here, actually his Graz Schumpeter lectures entitled Culture, a Culture of Growth, on the origins of the modern economy, in which he describes in great detail what happened there in Europe in those days and how they essentially built the foundations for the Industrial Revolution and the speeding of economic development and growth. Now, Petty took a physician's outlook on economic problems and decided to express himself in terms of number, weight, or measure, and to consider only such cases as have visible foundations in nature. Interestingly, leaving those depend upon the mutual minds, opinions, and appetites and passions of particular men to the consideration of others. You could say the former description applies pretty well to what became known as classical economics and the latter to marginalist economics, where minds, opinions, appetites, preferences played an important role, which played a role also in the early authors, of course, but not that much. They were concerned particularly with physical aspects of modern society, the growth of riches and the production system that generated them. Petty, the founder of a new science, but also, interestingly enough, an inventor himself. He invented a printing machine and a double bottom ship. I mean, he was for a time working on British naval ships that went to the Far East, where he apparently had seen perhaps catamarans, and he was inspired by this to invent the double bottom ship, which unfortunately in the harbor of London, when he tried to show it to the public, sank. Now, this is, of course, an interesting experience because it shows what happens to many innovators. I mean, they go bunk, it doesn't work. At any rate, the important thing to say here, I think, as already David Hume saw it, was improvements in that period were due to the imitation of foreigners. And actually, Hume was of the opinion that British excellency in industry was essentially a result of the imitation process. I mean, things you now would, accuse Japanese of, at least some decades ago, currently Chinese. So, I mean, imitation has always been an important part of the entire story. So growth was not growth was not so much the result of significantly moving the frontier of economically useful knowledge outwards in Europe, but of gradually approaching the existing frontier worldwide. Imitation rather than innovation. I've already talked about Marx and the idea of the production of absolute surplus value. I mean, Marx pointed out, that is the last quotation here, that Protestantism, by changing almost all the traditional holidays into work days, plays an important part in the genesis of capital. And this is also confirmed by Max Weber in his famous book. Now, of course, this kind of growth model, if you wish, extensive growth, and of course, hit barriers very, very quickly, and for a variety of reasons, including, the emergence of the culture of growth, it was not feasible in the long run, and something else appeared. Now, the first machine age, as I already indicated, it's essentially an age in which machine power replaces human and animal labor power. Machines step in and are substituted for certain activities performed by humans and by animals. Major inventions in that time are typically seen to be James Watt's steam engine, the first picture here, and Sir Richard Arkwright's spinning machine, the second one, but perhaps even more important, or at least as important, the automatic lathe, the slide rest lathe, which allowed for the construction of more powerful machines and permitted several machine operations to be performed simultaneously. Some economic historians told me that the relative importance of the slide rest is to be seen much higher than it is typically seen. Now, Smith, the first, so to speak, observer of the beginnings of the Industrial Revolution, I will discuss. And in his argument, of course, what is at the center of his discussion is the social division of labor. It decides, he wrote, about the skill, dexterity, and judgment with which society's labor is applied. Its deepening improves the productive powers of labor and impacts on the distribution of the product amongst workers, capitalists, and landlords. And clearly, in Smith's view, the social division of labor depends on the extent of the market, on the size of the system. If you have increasing returns to scale, internal to the economy as a whole, so to speak, the productivity of the system as a whole depends on the extent of the market. The larger the market, the lower unit costs, the greater competitiveness and whatnot. This is Smith's central theorem, and according to Alan Young, it's one of the most illuminating and fruitful generalizations in economics ever. It's a cornerstone of the doctrine of dynamically increasing returns to scale. And the important thing here again is also that the division of labor and the technological change accompanying it propagate themselves in a cumulative way, so that change becomes progressive and persistent. You enter a step of sustained development and growth. Now, Smith discussed three channels for which the division of labor increases productivity. First, improvements in the dexterity of workers as a gain from specialization. Secondly, a better use of workers and a better utilization of plant and equipment they operate. Very important. The more costly plant and equipment becomes, its utilization is of the utmost importance for a firm as regards the costs per unit of product it observes, and also by saving the time lost in passing from one kind of work to another. And finally, and most importantly, of course, the invention of machines, whereas the former two aspects all have, so to speak, a higher boundary, which is met sooner or later. Machines can be discovered again and again, and there is no limit to their use and the replacement of labor power. I think Smith was aware of that. However, his overall view was deficient in a variety of respects. Now, he saw the emergence of a sector we today call research and development, and insisted, interestingly enough, that the quantity of science applied in the economy decides about the economy's productivity. So science at, so to speak, the disposal of the economy becomes of great importance and drives the growth of the system. However, what Smith missed, and missed badly, was the role of the manufacturing sector as an engine of growth. I mean, he still believed that corn was the main product in the system, and it was the only product which entered directly or indirectly into the production of all products via the bread of workers they consume, but also via other kinds of inputs. He did not understand the growing importance of coal that fed the ovens in which steel was cooked and steel was transformed into machinery and so on and so forth. So the modern time that really became important was a time of coal and steel rather than corn. But he understood that technological progress implied largely the reconfiguring and recombining of existing particles of knowledge to form new particles. That is, the combinatoric metaphor was used by him, and it was later adopted by others as well. He saw that technological change is necessarily path dependent. As I said, others took it up. Marx, for example, Schumpeter became very famous for it. I mean, innovations as new combinations, and recently in Weizmann's growth model, the concept of recombinant growth. Now, Smith also understood that technological change alters what is the constraint binding changes in the distribution of variables given a system of production in use, right? I mean, what can be the rate of profits given the real wage rate in a given system described in terms of input-output structures? What about rents? What about one wage rate as opposed to another one? Skilled, unskilled workers, and so on and so forth. All this was, you could say, foreshadowed to some extent in Smith, and technical change was essentially conceived of as a movement of the distributional frontier outwards. It played an important aspect, an important role in Smith's understanding of the properties of the modern economy. And I think he had basically the following idea. I mean, we have here a diagram in which on the one axis there is R, which is the general rate of profits. He felt that in competitive conditions there is a tendency towards a uniform rate of profits. And on the other hand, we have W, the wage rate, the real wage rate measured in terms, say, of corn. And clearly enough, you have a system of production actually in use at a certain moment of time, representing technical knowledge, for example, technology T, which gives rise to an inverse relationship between the real wage rate and the rate of profits. And assume you are in point A at the beginning of your consideration, then of course, if there is technological change, that according to Smith is indeed beneficial in the sense that it reduces the coefficients of production labor coefficients, material coefficients, whatnot, then you may get a new constraint binding changes of the distributional variables, that is the curve D. Now you can see in this case, you can have both an increase in the real wage rate with no decrease in the rate of profits, or an increase also of the rate of profits and so on and so forth. So the system opens up and allows for alternative paths that could be described by utilizing the distributive potential of the new technology. It's the division of labor. Now, Smith felt that despite, this very optimistic picture he had in mind in some of his writings, of course, he never drew such a diagram or had an analytics describing the system, but his optimism, I think, was essentially due to this outward moving of the entire WR frontier away from the origin. And nevertheless, he was of the opinion that the rate of profits in the long run would fall because of an intensified competition of capitals, an argument which I think cannot be sustained. Let me immediately move on to David Ricardo. For how long can I speak? Sorry, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Chairman,
yeah,
may I ask?
My time to unmute myself. So take your time. You can...
Okay, I take a little more time. You are not yet bored with it.
No.
Well, David Ricardo. David Ricardo, I think, was really the author of the first machine age. He discovered fully and proved to the extent to which that was possible at the time the fundamental law of income distribution, and he wrote that the greater the portion of the result of labor that is given to the laborer, given technical conditions of production, the smaller must be the rate of profits, and vice versa. So he described the WR relationship, if you wish. And he saw that different forms of technical progress indeed move that WR relationship in different ways. He distinguished between direct labor saving, capital, that is indirect labor saving, indirect labor because labor, so to speak, embodied in capital goods, which are then used by direct labor, operated by direct labor, land saving, and all these different forms have typically different effects. He became very clear that landowners were historically opposed technical progress to the extent to which it increased the productivity of land. You could produce more corn per acre, and of course that meant that maybe their rents of land would be undermined. Workers would be against certain forms of technical progress because that reduced the real wage rate. So you have all these problems across the board, and Ricardo was the one to discuss them. Now, he also came up with an idea. Sorry, he also came up with an idea which I will come to a little later. He came up with an idea which was very critical of Smith. Smith had argued that the rent of land is due to the generosity of nature. If nature is very generous, landowners will reap a rent. And Ricardo said, no, that is completely foolish. The rent of land comes in because land is niggardly. And you will only get a rent if not equally qualitatively good land has to be cultivated side by side. The marginal land gets no rent, but the intramarginal rents get rent, and so on and so forth. And he also argued that, of course, what technical progress means to a large extent was using what Smith had called the free gifts of nature. Those free gifts of nature were not limited to agriculture, as Smith had surmised, And Ricardo asked, does nature nothing for man in manufactures? Are the powers of wind and water which move machinery in the system navigation nothing? There is not a manufacture which can be mentioned in which nature does not provide her assistance to man and gives it too generously and gratuitously. That is, technical progress consists in increasing man's control over the powers of nature. That is an important aspect of the entire story. And Ricardo was optimistic, interestingly, that there were still enormous opportunities to, so to speak, harvest the powers of nature. He was not, as it's often portrayed, like Malthus, a horseman of the apocalypse, seeing, so to speak, the stationary state around the corner and misery and deprivation ruling the lot of mankind. No, not at all. He wrote, we are happily yet in the progressive state and may look forward with confidence for a long course of prosperity. So I think there's a fundamental misunderstanding in the literature about Ricardo. When Ricardo talked about a falling rate of profit, he did so in terms of a counterfactual argument. That is to say, what would happen if there was accumulation of capital, a growth in population, but no further technical progress, and people would have to have recourse to always less fertile qualities of land. In this case, the rate of profit would fall, but technological progress would be a counter activity, and therefore he wrote, I'm convinced that there will be prosperity for a long period of time to come. He was also convinced that technical progress, as I already mentioned, has different effects, and he argued that there was particularly one kind of technical progress, the substitution of particular kind of machinery for human labor, not every kind, but a particular kind which is injurious to the interests of the class of laborers. He responded to the Luddite movement at the time, that is, those who destroyed machines because they thought machines are the only and terrible cause of workers' distress. And this is a form of technical progress which can be portrayed in the following way. We have a technology T, which allows for a WR relationship as it is depicted here, with a maximum rate of profits in the system corresponding to a hypothetical real wage rate of 0, capital R sub T. And then with machinery, a new kind of WR relationship with a maximum rate of profits R sub M, which, as you can see, is smaller than the rate of profits, the maximum one in the former situation. So the maximum rate of profits corresponding to a 0 wage rate will fall, but this does not mean, of course, that the actual rate of profits need to fall. Imagine that the real wage rate is W sub 0, and it remains constant as time goes by, just for the sake of the argument. Then you can see here, despite the falling maximum rate of profits, the actual rate of profits will rise from small r sub t to small r sub m. That is, to introduce new technologies may be beneficial despite the fact that the maximum rate of profit falls. What matters is exclusively the actual rate of profits. Now, the kind of technical progress Ricardo contemplated here is one which reduces what he called the gross products. You could say it reduces employment, because in its labor value accounting, the gross produce is just the amount of labor indeed spent in producing the social product of a particular year. But what is increased is profits. total profits will increase because wages fall and the two together produce a gross product that is smaller than before. So technological change may be beneficial to some parts of society, despite the fact that it is detrimental to the largest part of society, that is the laboring poor workers. Now, I think this is an important thing that Ricardo mentioned. Not all forms of technological change are universally beneficial. Some are certainly not. He describes here the situation, but he also found out that technological change may fall into an environment that is not up to it, will not be adopted, but it may come in later when the real wage rate and relative prices have changed. That he discusses induced technological change. And he's also very clear about the fact that technological change in terms of new machinery changes, in principle, the distribution of power between workers and capitalists. He is very clear that machines are what he calls mute agents of production. They do not strike. They do not ask for higher wages or better working conditions, so they change the power battle, if you wish. I think that is an important aspect that has always to be kept in mind. Now, Ricardo contemplated the end point, the terminal point of the process of mechanization that had just started, and that is full automation. He wrote, if machinery could do all the work that labor now does, there would be no demand for labor. Nobody would be entitled to consume a thing who was not a capitalist and who could not buy or hire a machine. In a fully automated system, how can workers survive if they are not also capitalists or landowners possessed of a sufficiently large property? That is, I think, an issue which is not, so to speak, an issue of the past, but might become an issue of the future. With digitization, artificial intelligence, and smart technologies, I think the problem Ricardo posed assumes unprecedented topicality. And there are some authors, such as Joseph Stiglitz, who are quite pessimistic in this regard. Now, Charles Babbage, very quickly. I think a very important author, called occasionally the father of the computer. This is maybe an exaggeration, but you will see that he was, so to speak, tracing this kind of path. He was a polymath, a Lucasian professor of mathematics at Cambridge University, the chair formerly held by Isaac Newton, an inventor, mechanical engineer, philosopher, and economist. An absolutely fascinating person. He superintended the development of the analytical engine, as he called it, in 1837, a mechanical general purpose computing machine which paved the way to the computer. Actually, it was supposed to calculate polynomial functions, to calculate also solutions of simultaneous equations, something the classical economists could have used for good because they were concerned with a system with a deep division of labor in which sectors were interrelated. And I mean, how was the price determined in one sector if it got inputs from other sectors and so on and so forth? They didn't have that tool at their disposal. In 1832, he published Of the Economy of Machinery and of Manufactures, and actually he wrote that the book was basically a result from the calculating engine, a precursor of the analytical engine. And this provided him with principles of generalization when he tried to systematize the various forms of the mechanical arts and improvements in them. Now, what is machinery all about? It's about to supersede the skill and power of the human arm, first and foremost. And there are two types of machines, those that generate power and those that transmit force and execute work. I've already told you previously that the lathe, the slide rest, these were essentially machines transmitting force and executing work, and they were very important. It was not only the generation of power, but tools that played an important role. Three kinds of advantages here associated with machinery and manufactures. First, the addition which they make to labor power. Yes, they increase the capacity of man to produce and increase its productivity. Secondly, there is an economy in using human time that increases productivity as well. It's just another expression of the same thing. And third, which is interesting, I think, very interesting indeed, the conversion of common and worthless substances into valuable products. I mean, what he indicates here is the rise of a new sector in the system, the material sciences. I mean, try to find out, I mean, what certain substances are useful for. Try to find out their properties, and also make use of the byproducts of the industrial process, of the waste products, which have to be disposed of in a costly manner. And if you find out their useful properties, you may transform what hitherto have been bad and discommodities to be disposed of in a costly way to goods and commodities you can sell profitably. So there's a built-in mechanism up to a point of utilizing waste products. Of course, you must make sure that the waste cannot be freely disposed into the nature, fouling the rivers, the seas, etc., etc. There must be a social environment that forces firms not to just get rid of all the beds. They must make use of them or dispose of them in a costly way, and that is an incentive to find out the useful properties. Now, Babbage's insights have led to scientific management. Think of the work of Frederick Winslow Taylor, subdividing the labor process and allocated particular workers to particular bits and pieces. And this is Babbage's principle, which he put forward. The master manufacturer, by dividing the work to be executed to different processes, each requiring different degrees of skill and force. These are the two categories on which he focuses attention here, and purchase exactly that precise quantity of both which is necessary for the execution of the process. And he points out that this process, the division of labor, can be applied with equal success also to the mental operations that have to be carried out, not only to the mechanical ones. That is one of the novelties that comes in with Babbage. And he points out the arrangements which ought to regulate the interior economy of a manufactory are founded on principles of deeper root and are capable of being usefully employed in preparing the road to some of the sublimest investigations of the human mind. Indeed, he was tinkering with the idea that what production means and what the division of labor means can perhaps be compared to the working of the human mind. This reads like a clairvoyant vision of a central element of the second machine age. As a result of going down this road today, the concept of artificial neural networks as a branch of artificial intelligence come quickly to one's mind. Now, the interesting thing is, and I think that also brings us back to Ricardo and his fear that automation might create huge social tensions and problems. Babbage pointed out that the interest of workers and that of their employers may be at variance. Yes, indeed, there are conflicts. As Smith pointed out, there is a struggle over the distribution of income, work conditions, and whatnot. And the Luddite movement illustrated this very vividly. Babbage therefore advocated the principle, quote, that every person employed should derive advantage from the success of the whole. That is, the benefits, the goodies of technological change should be shared out amongst the members of a society. And he actually put forward a scheme of profit sharing, which would allow workers to benefit from the prosperity of the business without affecting their daily wages. A profit scheme. So, I mean, let's distribute the surplus, so to speak, amongst all those involved, and let us not just leave those behind that lose their jobs and so on and so forth. I think this is an important theme again today. Marx, I will not speak, I think, about Marx because I'm already short of time. And just, I mean, to point out that Marx started from an article which young Friedrich Engels at the age of 23 had published in 1844, in which he attacked the political economists, Smith, Ricardo, but also some Germans, French, and whatnot, and pointed out that modernity is characterized by the sciences that have increased productive powers immeasurably. That's his word. He refers to leading inventors like Arkwright, Berthollet, Cartwright, Crompton, Davy, Hargreaves, von Liebig, and Watt. Their inventions, he wrote, raises the productivity of the soil and of labor infinitely, and allow the cause of misery and poverty and crime to be eliminated by a social transformation that abolishes private property, competition, and class conflict. So, I mean, it was technological change and the effects it brought about that made him think that a revolution today is possible, and a revolution that would increase income and prosperity of humankind as at large, and would make what he called a moral society possible. It would not only make it possible, it also would make it necessary, because the current forms of technology change benefiting mostly only one part of society, not the other, and other problems, that is crisis, economic cycles, and so on and so forth, they even made it necessary. So this was, I think, the starting point of Engels, but also of Marx. Technological change is basically a horn of plenty that would indeed be beneficial to society at large and produce a moral new society. I'm not going into the interim period, which did not talk much about technological change. Think of Leon Walras, think of Jevons, think of Menger and tutti quanti. In those authors, you do not find really much that is countable in terms of understanding the dynamism of the modern society. Exceptions are, of course, Leontiev, in particular Schumpeter and others, but that is something that is beyond this talk, which is already long enough. Let me come briefly to the second machine age. Now, since the 1970s, essentially, we are confronted with what is occasionally called the third industrial revolution, the dematerialization of information and the automation of production. Computers, microchips, and software replace human labor, especially manual labor, predictable activities based on codified knowledge in calculating and accounting. And indeed, there is unemployment experienced by many production workers, clerks, sales employees, etc. Author in 2015 provided an account of all that. Then there is the economic utilization of the internet and World Wide Web, which led to the electronic procurement and commerce, replacing again manual tasks in particular, and the rise of platform firms revolutionizing the distribution, allocation, and processing of orders by means of crowd workers. So there are lots and lots of technical changes. Let me just mention the Internet of Things, smartphones, etc. I think you're all aware of these things which transform our society and economy to a great extent, and I mean, leave behind effects, some of which are really problematic, whereas others are just wonderful. Artificial intelligence systems. Let me simply mention what I mean by this. They are defined as a new generation of information systems characterized by the following capabilities. They're able to interact with their environment and exchange information using various languages and collecting data from other computer systems. They can interact amongst themselves, but also with humans. They are able to interpret the information, recognize patterns, induce rules, and forecast events in order to improve decisions. They generate results, answer questions, receive orders, and give orders to other systems. They evaluate the outcomes of actions and improve decisions in order to reach certain goals. So, I mean, you can see managers are now progressively endangered by intelligent machines. There is the question of a new division of labor, not between man and man, but between man and machinery. Smart machinery, and it is clear that the smarter machines get, the more even the higher ranked people are in danger of being contested in their jobs. There are a few examples, I need not go into them. So the first machine age we have come across already. The second machine age is characterized by machines that learn themselves and become smarter as time goes by. As time goes by, meaning by absorbing ever more data and using those data in order to self-optimize. Now, machines can take over as in the past, which were hitherto carried out by humans. This is the replacement aspect of new machines. But machines and humans can also cooperate, which increases the productivity of humans. That is the augmentation aspect. We have both aspects, and the question is, of course, which one is important, when and why. I think both are important, and the augmentation aspect is now felt to a larger and larger extent, say in medicine, in law companies, in management at large. Now there's a productivity puzzle, and that is to be described quickly. Is artificial intelligence, etc., the source of an unprecedented acceleration in productivity, as some people claim? Now, if we look at the data, this is not to be seen up until now. Measured productivity has actually slowed significantly in several countries in recent years. There was this famous saying of Bob Solow, the productivity puzzle. You see computers everywhere, but their impact on productivity cannot be seen in the statistics. Now, what about artificial intelligence and this problem? Now, one of the arguments put forward is the new technologies are possessed of a huge transformative capacity. So there is a potential there, but we are right now witnessing the proverbial calm before the storm. The storm will break out as soon as complementary innovations will enhance the effectiveness of the new technologies and the necessary infrastructures and organizations have been implemented. This is, by the way, something we have observed in the history of technological change time and again, that one invention is good enough for small progress, but complementary inventions that combine with the former one really unfold tremendous power. Now, some aspects meant to be mentioned here is the formation of intangible assets, new software, new data sets, etc., etc. So we may be just in front of a big jump forward. Now, most types of human work require the skills of perception, cognition, and communication. In this regard, there have been substantial advances in machine learning. Machines are able to recognize objects. They use the data they process cumulatively to make relevant decisions and predictions. They learn the language of humans, communicate with them themselves. They are able to solve autonomously a growing number of problems. That is really, I think, amazing result, which we can listen to every day, listening to the news. All these developments speak in favor of a surging transformative impact. That will, I think, before long be reflected in productivity numbers. There is, of course, the problem of our statistics. How do we measure in a world of bits and bytes? It is different from a world of, say, corn or a world of coal and iron. Now, the current wave brings segmentations, and I will focus on two segmentations in the society here. On the one hand, it brings a segmentation amongst firms. We see the emergence of companies possessed of some kind of monopoly power that is difficult to contest and can be expected to persist for a long time to come. These are so-called superstar firms, which follow, so to speak, the winner takes all dynamics. They are based on machine learning. They use very often platforms, think of the big five, Amazon in particular, and networks, and benefit from new forms of dynamically increasing returns, and are possessed of a high degree of stability and perseverance. I mean, they may run into difficulties internally because becoming large may even eventually result in becoming too large and running into difficulties, as we have experienced in the past as well. But at present, once ahead of their competitors, the lead of such firms can be expected to increase over time and eventually force competitors to leave the market. The built-in engine of self-optimizing machines in data capitalism involves a persistent and, in all probability, increasing profitability spread between superstar firms, the monopolistic sector, if you wish, broadly speaking, on the one hand, and firms in the competitive segment, the competitive sector on the other. And there is also an indication that there's another segmentation taking place between skilled and unskilled workers. While the wages of the firm are rising swiftly, those of the latter stagnate or even decline. Now, there is a situation which Ricardo already discussed, and Ricardo was the one basically it's hardly ever noticed, who brought up the problem of the in welfare economics nowadays of the compensation, the Higgs compensation problem. And he argued that there are policy decisions, but also innovations in which the loss is wholly on one side and the gain wholly on the other. And secondly, and more importantly, for our discussion, the loss may be far greater on one side and the gain is on the other. Though societally speaking, society loses. Now, of course, not society as a whole, but some lose. And those who gain could not even in principle compensate those who lose. such innovations are generally to be avoided. Now, the question is whether we have cases in which such innovations prevail. Now, what I would like to do now, a little analytics, but I use a picture immediately. Time is really, I'm so sorry. My inclination to speak is, it seems infinite. So beware of me. Let's imagine we have a situation in which the wage rate is given here on this axis, W, whereas the rate of profits in the competitive sector is given here, R sub C, and in the monopolistic sector, R sub M. And let's assume we start from a technology given by the green contour. You see the green contour? In this case, we have a situation in which, as I contemplate here, we are here, and in P, if we go to the y-axis, we can immediately see that the wage rate is W superscript 0. That is the current wage rate. The corresponding rate of profits in the competitive sector is R sub C superscript 0, and in the monopolistic sector, R subscript M, monopolistic, superscript 0. That is the situation at the beginning. Now we have a new technology, artificial intelligence and all that, and that moves the relationship between the distribution of variables outside. And let's assume the new one is the green one. Now the green one, the red one. The red one is the frontier in the new situation. Now what you can see here, you have an improvement, of course, in the wage rate. I could now distinguish between skilled and unskilled labor. What I've bunched together here is just one wage rate, because I can't have 4 dimensions to produce a picture. I have 3 dimensions, so I can only discriminate between 2 rates of profits. But what can be the case is that the wage rate of the unskilled workers falls, that of the skilled workers rises, the average wage rate of both rises, but the share of wages falls. And what you see here in addition is that the competitive sector loses in the sense that the new rate of profits is smaller than the old one, whereas the sector that is monopolistic increases its rate of profits. Now the superscript 1 is of importance. So you have a situation now portrayed with regard to distributional function that shows you what has happened here. And now let me just come to the conclusion. Sorry, this is a problem. The new wave of technological progress benefits first and foremost the monopolistic segment and to some extent also skilled workers. It is detrimental to the interests of unskilled workers and also to that of firms in the competitive segment. There's a twofold segmentation taking place amongst firms and capital owners on the one hand and amongst workers on the other. A falling share of wages reflects the diminishing overall power of workers in the dispute over the distribution of income. Now, concluding remarks. Technological progress changes and challenges received socioeconomic structures. It does not distribute the benefits and costs equally amongst all members of society. It is not the warm rain invoked in the solo growth model. If you remember your class on macroeconomics. While it opens a horn of plenty for some, it may imply disgrace and even misery for others, at least for a certain period of time. Technological progress had always been directed in one way or another. As Ricardo was clear with regard to policy measures such as the corn laws, this is the case also with regard to innovations. I've already given you the quotations. In such cases, those who gain could not even in principle compensate those who lose, as I've mentioned. Such innovations ought in general to be avoided if possible. Innovation should rather be steered in directions that are favorable to the living conditions of mankind and other species at large, and ward off the dangers threatening their survival. And finally, Schumpeter referred to innovations aptly as processes of creative destruction. Now, people typically admire the successful innovator for the creative part of his or her activity. They tend to ignore the destructive part of it in terms of lost jobs and skills, tasks, bankrupt firms, or the disappearance of entire industries. Clearly, both parts have to be imputed to the innovator. Now, how to involve the innovator in compensating the losers? In the absence of ideal risk markets and confronted with fundamental uncertainty, the costs and benefits of innovations and their distribution amongst agents will only become clear as time goes by. This excludes the possibility of compensating the losers ex ante and necessitates compensate them ex post. Hence, a scheme of redistributing income and wealth appears to be indispensable and cannot be rejected with reference to the efficient functioning of ideal markets as we find them discussed, say, in general equilibrium theory, because the turmoil caused by the process of creative destruction, there are no such markets. This is an insight that Schumpeter had at an early time. I remember a talk by Kenneth Arrow in Vienna a year before he unfortunately passed away, in which he admitted that he had for a long time overlooked the impact of innovations of the economic system and also its welfare properties. Well, I'm very sorry for the long talk. Please forgive me, but I had prepared these damn slides and I had to get through them. So thank you very much for your patience, and thank you.
Yes, hello. Thanks, Heinz. I enjoyed your presentation very much, and as always, learned from it. There's one main point, though, that in some ways puzzles me, and where maybe we disagree, or maybe not. There seemed to be for my taste, too much technological determinism. Yes, technology does matter, but if we are looking at what has been happening to income distribution inequality, which has been rising, as we all know, very significantly, particularly in the US, then I think it has been gradually recognized that it's a failure to put that down to pure technology. Skill bias, technical change actually seems to be a lot less popular than it were just a few years ago, and I think that is very good, because what happened was to a large extent the effect of, call it, institutional political power changes. So to put it down to just technology makes that happen, I think is a mistake. A bit the same way with some of the extreme profits that we observe. At least in many cases, I think they are down to very traditional, old-fashioned processes like state monopoly, sometimes enforced through intellectual property rights. So I guess what I was missing in some sense as a complement would be these non-technological, but call it social, institutional, organizational power elements behind what we're seeing. So anyway, thanks a lot again.
Well, Peter, thanks very much for your question. I think this is an important question, and I was never, ever inclined to think that there is some kind of technological determinism. This is all something that is happening within a particular society which has its own rules and mores and whatnot, and whatever is being put forward in terms of, say, a new page of the book of blueprints of technological alternatives has to pass the test of the particular society under consideration, and therefore it is always shaped to some extent by those institutions. I mean, the mindset of people and whatnot. Now, for sure, this I didn't want to say. However, of course, in the end, if you want to discuss questions of income distribution, for example, you must discuss it in terms of a system of production that is in use and a system of production that will come into use before long, and then you can see, I mean, what are the outcomes, what are the options, also political options, and this is what I try to do. So no, I think you're quite right, and I think in the manuscript I even have a discussion of this issue of directed technological change. It has always been directed by some people or others, say the military forces. Much of it is directed by the military forces, by military concerns as regards surveillance and observation, or by weaponry and whatnot, or by the rich and so on and so forth. So I think what the idea is towards the end, in particular, when we come very briefly to policy recommendations. Now look at the system as a whole and look at the people as a whole and try to be inclusive rather than exclusive. I mean, a case in point is of course the treatment of the Big Five. I mean, they have even been financed partly and subsidized by the state. No? Sorry.
So any other question? It says Athanasius.
Yes, thank you very much. The problem of the determinism, technological determinism, addressed the causation part. I would like to address the part of the effects. For example, your last slide, I'm reading how to involve the innovator in compensating the losers. You know, this is a steering effect. There are so many effects, so many collateral effects that are unknown. You cannot.
I cannot hear you.
You can't hear me.
There are too many voices now.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Now it's better, yes. You had probably two loudspeakers or so. Yeah.
Okay.
Now we
I just wanted to ask you the question of steering effects, addressing effects. It's so difficult. Who is supposed to compensate? You know, should it be the law? Which legal system would it be? It's very difficult, and that's what the the theory of evolution is all about. They say that since we cannot steer effects, we let it to the social reality to find solutions. That is to say, it is a very complex situation. On the one hand, you have the causation problem. On the other hand, the effects, and there is no linearity in these things. Thank you.
If you refer to the famous doctrine of the Scottish Enlightenment, that there are unintended consequences of purposeful human action, then I perfectly agree with you. Indeed, it is a highly complex problem. There is the causation, and the effects may be partly entirely different from what you expected. And we experience this in these days. I mean, in at the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and for a long period of time, nobody would have thought that the planet Earth is getting into difficulties because of global warming and climate change. I mean, all these have been effects which were not accounted for by humans when they came up with, say, the steam engine and whatnot, and the heating up of the planet. So I perfectly agree with you, but I think the problems are still those trying to do the best to get new technologies which are beneficial to large numbers of people, and not just only to a few who are perhaps capable then of protecting their own wealth, their own properties, and so on and so forth, to the detriment of others. I think it's a question of whether there is solidarity or there is not. And I think we have for a long time just ignored it.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. So, any other question? Ron.
Some people, well, first of all, thank you very much for the talk. It was, well, I really enjoyed it. Some people think that we've now entered a new machine age. The most famous person writing like this is a woman named Shoshana Zuboff. And the term she uses for the type of age we're in is called surveillance capitalism. And it first became apparent to most people with the role of Cambridge Analytica in the Brexit referendum, whereby essentially the internet is being used to manipulate people into doing things that they wouldn't otherwise have done. In the most standard example, when you look at one site, the algorithms are programmed to send you to ever more radical sites. And so people end up thinking things they would never have thought, and politically behaving in ways they wouldn't have done, and so on. And it's all essentially being manipulated by the superstar companies you refer to. So some people think this is something that's qualitatively different. It's not quite the machines controlling the people, but it's not far from that. I just wondered if you ever thought of that.
Yes, of course. I mean, that is a most important aspect of the opportunities provided by new technologies. Surveillance, observation, and so on and so forth, monitoring. And it can be used to extremely terrible use, as we all know. I'm perfectly aware of that, and in our book, which we are bringing out, I mean, that is being dealt with in a number of chapters that are contained in the book. Yes, you see, as I said, I think in my talk, there are goodies coming with the new technologies, and there are also baddies. And the question is, I mean, whether society is capable of warding off the danger coming from the baddies, or whether it is not capable of doing so. If it's not capable of doing so, you may indeed get a George Orwell kind of situation, and in certain areas of China where the Uyghurs are being looked after, that is already, it seems, the case from what we learn from people who have gone there. So it offers tremendous opportunities for creating a dystopia, creating a new 1984. I do not deny that in the least, and therefore I think it is of the utmost importance that we are all very much alerted to the danger that is there. Think about the United States, and recently, just the capability of producing fake news that 40% of the population are inclined to believe that, I mean, Mr. Trump is still the president. I mean, this is enormous. That is to say, I mean, this is an old topic, of course, in the political literature, but also in the economic literature. Friedrich von Wieser pointed out that what is perhaps most important for people to get power is to get hold of the minds and beliefs and the thinking of people. Indeed, I think that's the capture of the mind. That is what counts. And I think the new technologies are able to do that to an extent which we have never experienced before. And that is an enormous danger that one has to face, I think. You are quite right. I don't know, by the way, the book. I mean, could you kindly send me the title and the author? I did not quite understand the name of the lady that wrote that book about supervillains capitalism.
Yes, I'll send it to you. But her name is Shoshana Zuboff, and it's called Surveillance Capitalism. But I'll send you it.
Yeah, be so kind. Yes. No, I think that's
it's not a very good book.
Important.
The only thing I will say, the book itself is not very good, but the idea is everywhere.
Thank you for telling me. No, but I mean, the problem you raised and she raises apparently is high on the agenda in the discussion of artificial intelligence and all that. I mean, just think about Rudi Kurzweil's view about the point of machines taking over and controlling now man. I mean, man, so to speak, now becoming the slaves of machinery. That is the extreme description of what is could happen.
Yeah.
The singularity point, I mean. Okay.
Didn't Popper say at any point that the definition of human against machine is that the human has an objective of its own and machines don't? They all the time have an objective given to them by anyone. It only becomes really screwed if artificial intelligence is able to have its own objectives and its own tasks and define its own tasks. Then it becomes get really dangerous, I guess.
Yeah, but Gregor, the problem is, of course, a machine can define its objectives as well. There's no problem, you know. And one objective, when you look in our society, is very often stability or something like that. And machines can, so to say, create an environment where stability is the great objective. By the way, there was, I think already in the 50s, a novel by L'Hotel is the author. It's L'Île des Oiseaux de Fer, and their computers have taken over, you know. I mean, they commanded then the human beings, because in the beginning, of course, human beings have given the power to the computer. And this story is really frightening, you know. And the objective for stability, but you know, for stability, you can do a lot of things.
It's a deeply philosophical question what an objective is. It's similar to saying artificial intelligence could be creative only just because it is able to combine everything it learned by itself and combines together and so on. But pure, real creativity. Remember Helmut Blaseo and his thoughts about this cognitive theory. He's still saying a Turing machine is not able to create anything new under the sun.
Yeah,
That's really the question. It's real innovation and real creativity is really coming from a machine. It feels like intelligence, but the strong artificial intelligence, I still doubt that they really can give themselves new other objectives than what they became from anyone who created them.
But the machine can force people to create something.
Yeah.
You know, the machine can force people to create something.
Yes, there's no doubt. Right?
Well, I mean,
someone else. Mhm.
This was not a question to me. I presume.
No, 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 no. It was just a remark.
No, but I think this is, so to say, the quintessence, of your last section in a way. Where do we go with this technical progress and so on? And then, of course, we have people who, it's not always technical, we have a social, political progress. And if you, we might end up, not we, but people, humankind might end up in a very strange or alien state which we don't want to have, maybe now.
Mm.
I don't just forget about the last two sentences.
Yes, let me just add one aspect. The question of the social, the question of the political, the question also of what we want, whether that comes in when. I mean, we have experienced recently that machines are, for example, used in order to improve the hiring process of people. They check their credentials, they compare them, they are less emotional or not emotional at all, whereas humans are emotional and very often come up with decisions which are not impartial. And they have nevertheless discovered that in order for those machines to be able to work, you must install algorithms they can follow. But these algorithms can, so to speak, show your personal footprint. And your personal footprint may be such that the machines then execute a program which is utterly unfair. They have that experience with some of the big five, where they hired against females because, I mean, there was some element in the algorithm which computers have to learn, of course, to use, that made them decide in a way which was not really wanted at all. And we had many of these things. That is to say that machines can work, they can play on algorithms, but they have to be taught to use them. And as far as I know, only humans are able to teach them up until now. And this will perhaps remain for a longer time to come. But I do not know really whether man will really be the, so to speak, the greatest thing on earth forever, and whether machines cannot take over. We have been so often, or others have been so often wrong in not being able to anticipate the capacity of machines to do this and that, to play chess, to play Go, to do that, and so on and so forth, that I would not risk nowadays to put forward a claim what they cannot and what they can in the future. I just don't know. But I think the important problem still for us, I mean, we are all at a certain age where we might not be able to see the new brave world, the brave new world, the really brave new world. But we will experience, I think, a world in which surveillance and monitoring becomes much more effective and may create us enormous difficulties.
Mm.
But at the same time, you see, if you think about environmental problems, pollution, if you think about climate problems, I mean, new technologies that can be utilized may, and I think we can only hope that they will be of great use in this regard, because otherwise I think it's not, so to speak, machines that will perhaps take over control, but it's perhaps the climate that will get rid of us. I mean, actually something already contemplated by Karl Marx in the 1970s, where he said, I mean, we cannot exclude that the two entities, I mean, the planet and mankind, can coexist for a long period of time. It may be the case that the planet will get rid of mankind because of all kinds of damages it does. And so argued, by the way, Max Weber. So two major intellectuals in the social sciences were quite pessimistic as regards this. And I'm not talking about this Cambridge astronomer and physicist who recently came up with similar ideas.
So are you saying that probably artificial intelligence is a way how nature gets rid of human beings?
Sorry, say it again. I couldn't.
Probably artificial intelligence is just a way how nature gets rid of humans.
Yes.
Just kidding. I don't know. I would like to thank you very much. Also, Ron, for the introduction, and Heinz for your speech.
Thank you very much, and please forgive me for speaking for so long. I apologize.
Very interesting. Was it?
Thanks very much indeed.
So,
Thank you.
bye bye.
Thank you.
Goodbye. Goodbye.
Bye. Bye. Bye.
Thank you very much.